You have found yourself now at a Sunday school class called, oh my goodness, I want to say The Color of Compromise, and that's not right. Yes, right.
It is.
Yes, it is right. Okay, I'm just my brain's a little busy these days. And Mary Boote is an elder at First Presbyterian Church of Deerfield. We are in a Sunday school class that is in a great new collaboration among several Presbyterian churches called FIDE. And we welcome all of you from Lake Forest Presbyterian Church, from Arlington Heights, from Libertyville Presbyterian Church, from Wheaton, from Deerfield Presbyterian Church. Did I miss anybody today? I am so glad that you are all here and so grateful for Mary. And we're going to make our way right into the class because we know she has lots of stuff to teach us. So Mary, would you kick us off?
Yeah, or at least I have a lot to say. So just to remind you, in the last 3 or so weeks, we have looked at why we are here. We've defined terms. We have breezed through way more history than you can imagine. And last week, I focused on 2 central questions, which we'll come back a little bit to today. I also want to sincerely thank those of you who have reached out to me this week to let me know your thoughts and your pushback to my thoughts. This means that you are actively engaged in the questions, and I thank you. I've obviously answered those questions. You hear the bias in my voice as I support Tisby's work, but I have asked you to answer those questions for yourself, showing support, showing understanding, as you know both sides of the argument, even as you craft your own. And I just want you to know that I hear the passion in your voice as you respond. And I thank you for your engagement in these questions. So I'm going to share and we'll get started. Okay, today we are looking at week 4. We're going into the civil rights movement of the 60s and the religious right at the end of the 20th century. Not so much to cover today in history, but some important topics. So in the last couple of weeks, I've shown you some personal pictures. I've shown you my daughter's confirmation picture to talk about my own complicity. I've shown you pictures of traveling to St. Louis with my son as we looked at the Manifest Destiny and Dred Scott position. Today, I'm showing you my wedding picture. And I'm not showing you my wedding picture because I want you to see Dan and me in our full glorious polyester outfits here. I'm showing you this because it's the only picture I could find of the front window of my church, the window that I looked at for hours and hours as I was growing up. We've been talking about this a little bit in the last couple of weeks. This slide shows you that window in the upper left a little more clearly. And it shows you the image that hung in my living room, that hung in my grandparents' homes, and that hung in all of my Sunday school rooms. We've talked about this white perspective, and you should recognize that this Jesus looks very white, even as you might note that he's got really nice hair and a nice tan. But anyway, he's very white. I want you to think about what it means to see Christianity from a white perspective, just as I need to consider what this perspective has done to my understanding of race. The comment that I hear very often is, yeah, but I don't see color. I have Black friends and I treat them just like any of the other of my friends, or my grandchildren are colorblind. They play with Black and white equally. So when we use these kind of phrases as white Christians, we have the best intentions, and that is our white perspective. How might I don't see color sound from a different perspective, a Black perspective? If you don't see someone else's color, then you don't see that they experience racism. Ignoring the ongoing inequality inhibits the fight against racism because you don't see it. When you say, I'm colorblind, it's the equivalent of saying, oh, and I see you as white. I see you just like me. In other words, it's a denial of reality. Take a quick look at this slide. the dangers of an I don't see color mentality. And I'm just going to read these to you. It allows you to ignore the complexities of racial issues. You're not actively dismantling your own prejudices, and we all have them. It minimizes the struggles of people of color in today's society. It limits your ability to appreciate individualism, and you cannot fix something if you cannot see it. It means that you're denying the lived experiences of people of color. So a different approach, rather than saying I'm colorblind, might be to embrace color braveness, moving away from color blindness to recognizing one's racial identity and its role in society. And that's really what I'm going to end with today. I'm going to look at the racial identity of my home church, First Presbyterian Deerfield, and its role in society. And I would ask you to think about what that means for your own home churches. Color braveness is an understanding that understanding our racially stratified society gives us more of a willingness to work for change. Color braveness is having the conviction to identify racial injustice and then having a concrete plan to address it. Jim Wallace, the founder of Sojourners, takes this a step further. He says, white Christianity is an idolatry, and idols separate us from God. So we should be asking ourselves, if this is something that separates us from God, how do we lessen that separation? And I see that as a challenge. We need to ask ourselves how a white Jesus is on the side of Black people. I want you to think about last week's questions. How does your theology inform your lived expression of being a follower of Christ? Must we remain silent? And then this is the primary question for today. How and why might white and Black Christians see racial justice differently? A little bit of context first. You saw this slide last week. It's the following the Civil War, the Reconstruction, moving into Jim Crow, 2 million African Americans move out of the South to escape racism and seek jobs. And then you saw this slide last week. Because of the tension that is created with that movement, 3 of the most significant race riots in the United States happened in Illinois, East St. Louis, Springfield, and Chicago. Now I'm going to give you a very, very fast overview of the civil rights movement. I think you generally know this. I just want to set you mentally for where we're going today. You see the Supreme Court here from 1954. That's the Brown versus Board of Education ruling that started to integrate schools. You'll see a picture of Emmett Till. That was 1955. Rosa Parks is 1955. Little Rock 9 and the deployment of federal troops escorting students into high school is 1957. Also in 1957, Eisenhower is signing a Civil Rights Act that helps protect voting rights. The other slides you see here are counter sit-ins, freedom riders being met with violence from police, and the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing with the killing of these 4 young girls. 1963, you see the March on Washington, which culminates in Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech in the Mall. 1964, you see LBJ signing the Civil Rights Act of 64, which prevents discrimination on basis of race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. And you see Martin Luther King standing behind him. 1965, Malcolm X is assassinated. 1965 is the 3 marches from Selma to Montgomery, with the March of 1965 march becoming known as Bloody Sunday. Also in 1965, you see again Martin Luther King standing with LBJ as the Voting Rights Act of 65 was passed. This is preventing the use of literacy tests in voting requirements. 1968, April 4th, Martin Luther King is assassinated, so you don't see him standing with LBJ here on April 11th when he signs the Fair Housing Act 1968. And then remember this image from last week. It's the restrictive covenant of a member of our church in Deerfield, and the red stamp on the top of that says racial restrictions invalid per Civil Rights Act of 1968. All right, that's your quick overview to just set your mind. I've included 4 civil rights pieces of legislation in this overview because, quite frankly, these pieces of legislation could not have happened without the work of the church behind them, without Martin Luther King going to the White House to meet LBJ, without Black Southern pastors, without marches, without white Christian martyrs in the freedom rides. The church was not only the meeting place for the movement, it was also the center of the movement. Both Black and white Christian churches supported the movement. It's what brought the movement about, but there is a very big difference in how that came to pass. Again, I repeat, the country could have not have gotten to where we were with the civil rights legislation without the support of the church. But in general, the support of the Black church looked very different from the support of the white church. We're going to look at how and why that might be. We're going to look at 2 very different models for handling racial tension by looking at 2 great religious leaders, Billy Graham and Martin Luther King. You know both of them. Both are Christian men of faith. Both are preachers, both draw large audiences, both give powerful sermons and speeches, both are viewed as leaders of a broader faith. How did they differ when it came to racial justice? We're going to start with Billy Graham. Now, I know Billy Graham. He's a Christian moderate. I was raised on him. There was not a single crusade that I did not watch with my family as a child growing up, partly because there were consequences if I didn't watch with my family. But as early as 1953, Billy Graham became known for his support of Blacks. He took an active stance to make a statement about segregation when he took down ropes at one of his crusades that separated whites from Blacks. And I'm quoting, "Either these ropes stay down or you can go on and have the revival without me," end quote. Now remember that a great number of Graham's financial backers expected Graham to support segregation or at least to stay silent on race. But Graham did not budge on this issue. Every crusade would be integrated, period. And we have to recognize what a courageous stance this must have been in 1953. During the civil rights movement, Graham preached, Jesus was not a white man. He was not a Black man. He came from that part of the world that touches Africa and Asia and Europe. Christianity is not a white man's religion, and don't let anyone ever tell you that it's white or Black. Christ belongs to all people. He belongs to the whole world. So Graham, here you have Graham inviting Martin Luther King to pray at one of his crusades. And Graham preached a series of crusades in Alabama, saying that the gospel would tear down walls of division between race. We see the importance of his work alongside of Dr. King. He is reaching out actively to Blacks. Now, no one would accuse Billy Graham of being a racist. But even some of Graham's biggest admirers say that his stance on racism during the 50s and 60s and on was, and I'm quoting, wobbly. One of Graham's historians says, quote, Graham had episodes of courage, unquote, such as integrating his revivals, inviting Martin Luther King to pray, and even at one point he bailed Martin Luther King out of jail in Georgia. That same historian notes, however, that, quote, Billy Graham was a civil rights coward. Graham, active politically on other political issues, refused to get involved with race issues, saying that the emphasis should be on, and you've heard this before, conversion, not social impact. In other words, he is opposing racism and segregation in principle, but then he refuses to take any action to support the cause in many forms. And I'm quoting here again, there wasn't a major Protestant leader in America who obstructed King's beloved community more than Billy Graham did. So remember those questions? Graham spoke of racism as a heart problem that could be solved simply by converting people to Christ. Quote, Graham's inability to act in support of civil rights was stymied by his theology. A spiritual and moral awakening, from his perspective, would solve the nation's race problems. Question 2. Graham was politically active in many causes, but when it came to civil rights, he was missing in action. He skipped King's March in Selma, for example. He did not stand up with other ministers and pastors who protested for civil rights. While other white ministers lost their jobs or even their lives for the cause, Billy Graham was silent. Quote, in the civil rights movement's crunch time, Graham was absent. I believe that the problem of race is in loving our neighbor. Put the brakes on all of this civil rights stuff. Social action is a distraction from the gospel. That's a white Christian moderate perspective. Tisby is arguing that Graham's moderation is what causes his complicity with racism. So let's look at the contrast with MLK, who is taking a different approach, active, working towards advocacy. I'm not going to focus heavily on Martin Luther King. We just celebrated Martin Luther King Day. Quite frankly, you should know this stuff, but we will focus on 2 things. Tisby argues that we've made MLK into something that he was not. We have made him much less radical than he was. We've sanitized him. He was much more than a series of lovely quotes on posters. And we tend to then downplay how revolutionary he really was. I think we need to see that a riot is the language of the unheard, is one of his quotes. His emphasis on the social dimension of Christianity puts him at odds with white evangelicals who are arguing that change comes through conversion, through transformation of the heart. The second thing I want to focus on with King is, briefly, his letter from a Birmingham City jail. In 1963, King was jailed for holding marches without a permit. He and others were protesting the treatments of Blacks in Birmingham, Alabama. While imprisoned, King received a letter from 8 moderate white Alabama clergymen, and he wrote a reply, a letter from a Birmingham jail. In the letter to Martin Luther King, the 8 white clergymen say, we recognize the natural impatience of people who feel that their hopes are slow in being realized. But we are convinced that these demonstrations are unwise and untimely. When rights are denied, a cause should be pressed in the courts and in negotiations among local leaders and not in the streets. So how did King respond? He writes back, "I've almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's greatest stumbling block in his stride towards freedom is not the white citizen's counselor or the Ku Klux Klanner, but the white moderate who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice. Be patient. Demonstrations are unwise. Work with the courts versus work towards positive peace. Work towards the presence of justice. Do we want order or do we want justice? Do we prefer negative peace, which is the absence of tension, or positive peace, which is the presence of justice? And by the way, this is sounding a little familiar to me as we look at this past summer. Tisby is arguing that in a moment that called for moral courage, the American church responded to much of the civil rights movement with passivity, with indifference, and even with outright outrage. Christian moderates, he says, rather than courageously confronting racism, were complicit in their silence. We've heard this same argument before. Silence in the face of evil, is itself evil. God will not hold us guiltless. Not to speak is to speak. Not to act is to act. That is Tisby's context to our central question. How and why might white and Black Christians see racial justice differently? Moderation, caution, go slow, activism, or advocacy. Now, all of this seems theoretical until we look at concrete examples. Today, I want to do what's known as a racial autobiography, really simply. And by the way, I've put a link to that in your chat function so you can look at this in more detail. The concept is that we need to know our own stories. We need to understand our own stories, and we need to remember where we have come from in order to be able to go ahead into the future. We're going to look specifically ourselves, and we're going to start with the Chicago Presbytery. Now, doesn't this look like fun reading? It's the minutes of the stated meeting of the Presbytery of Chicago, February 11th, 1958. And I have to say that it is really a beautiful document. It starts with a summary. It reminds the Assembly that in 1953, they called on all Christians to work for, not wait for, a church and society which rise above racial restrictions. This call to work for, not wait for, action was taken very seriously. When this report is then written 5 years later, they go on to summarize numerous things that have been accomplished by the Presbytery. Here are a few. It suggests political action where injustice is seen by supporting immigration reform. It suggests political action by supporting judicial reform. And it concerned itself with the problem of housing as a central issue in racial segregation and other forms of discrimination. There are moments when you simply want to say, yay, Presbyterians, good job. General Assembly, thank you. The General Assembly ends their document by saying, and some of the most encouraging work in integrating churches in the entire denomination is being done in our own Chicago Presbytery. All right, but this is where it gets personal. And if you're from Deerfield, you pretty well know where I'm going. What's our racial autobiography? Do you know what's going on? Those of you from other churches, our story is unique to us, but I am arguing that your stories are probably not so different, even if they are less visible. Again, we need to hear our own stories. We need to understand our own stories. We need to remember where we came from so that we know how to go forward in the future. That General Assembly report that I just read to you was from February 58. What's Deerfield Presbyterian's racial autobiography? Well, meanwhile in Deerfield in 1959, a developer started building an integrated housing subdivision called Floral Park for middle income families. And again, this is not low income housing, affordable housing. This is middle income housing. Village officials discovered that developers intended to sell a portion, up to 20% of the homes to African Americans. Town leaders did not openly admit to opposing integrated housing, but suddenly they objected to the building of the housing development on the basis that Deerfield needed more parks. The project was met with heated resistance, and the developer was forced to abandon the project. Ultimately, the village condemned the developer's property and took it over as public parkland. This public parkland argument is used to skirt the issue of integration, of keeping Black middle-income families out of our community. The photo that you see here is a photo of two of the houses that were built on the property before it was condemned. And you're seeing some of the protests or support going on there. I want to real quickly show you a couple of pictures from Art Shea, a photographer who lived in Deerfield, who chronicled what was happening. The Deerfield Public Library has an extensive archive on this time period in Deerfield if you want to look further, and they did wonderful programming on this just recently. Here you're seeing civil rights protests in Deerfield. You're seeing Blacks and whites unified together in protest. You're seeing Eleanor Roosevelt coming to Deerfield to support fair housing. And you're seeing the vote that resulted in a neighborhood park rather than proposed integrated subdivision. That's our town's history. What is our church's history with that? Again, some really fun reading. This is the minutes of the stated meeting of the Presbytery of Chicago, December 8, 1959. And in these minutes, there is a resolution regarding Deerfield. And by the way, Presbyterians from Deerfield, I'm a little obsessive, so I've typed it all out for you here if you want to go back and read that. You can find it when the link to this class is posted on our church website. It's there for you, but I'll just summarize it. The resolution regarding Deerfield starts back with that history, where in 1953, the Presbytery is calling on all Christians to work for, not wait for, a church and society which rise above racial restrictions. And the resolution reminds Deerfield that in 1955, the Assembly called for the launching of, quote, Operation Desegregation in our churches and in the communities in which our churches work and serve. This statement included a call to work for desegregation in housing in our communities, private as well as public housing, and to refrain from entering into arrangements or covenants that tend to encourage segregation. The resolution regarding Deerfield calls upon Christians to see as of first importance the need of minority families for equal housing opportunities and for adequate housing, and to make their houses available to all qualified purchasers without regard to race. So in essence, the Chicago Presbytery is scolding First Presbyterian Deerfield. I'm going to read a little bit more of the report for you here. This summary of the General Assembly social deliverances makes clear and decisive the continuous support of our church for non-segregated church in a non-segregated society. Against this background, we must project the recent developments in Deerfield for non-segregated middle-income housing. Again, we must affirm the statements of our General Assembly in the responsibility of Christians to work for the positive right, constitutionally and as Christians, in our land for all people. The Chicago Presbytery is making it pretty clear in its directive. We urge the Presbyterian Church of Deerfield to work toward the ideals of our church, a non-segregated church in a non-segregated society. So, how well do we know our own story? How well do we understand our racial autobiography? Deerfield Presbyterian is a white, middle-class, moderate body of Christians. So we responded exactly as you would expect a white, middle-class, moderate body of Christians to respond. I'm going to hit you with these 3 questions one more time. Your theology, a voice in society, how might whites and blacks see racial justice differently? And now we're going to look at the minutes of our session, December 1959. This is within a couple of weeks of that resolution regarding Deerfield from the Chicago Presbytery. And again, I am simply going to read this to you. The entire village of Deerfield is in turmoil over the proposed Floral Park real estate development by Progress Development Corporation. These plans for a non-segregated community of homes are a part of the everyday conversation of every family within the village. It's not surprising, therefore, that these problems and questions come up in connection with meetings of many of the church organizations, including the church school. We are anxious to fulfill our obligations as a church to lead this community towards civic decisions which are consistent with our Christian faith. We are equally anxious that we shall not permit the prestige of this church to be used to back any commercial venture. We have therefore prepared the following statements by session. Number 1. Under no circumstances can we retreat from the basic teaching of this church concerning the brotherhood of all mankind regarding race. Without going out looking for arguments, this belief will be stated bluntly whenever the occasion arises. We are sure that when and if non-segregated housing comes to Deerfield, this church should and will welcome all Christians who would worship and study with us. In the absence of more compelling evidence of moral right or wrong on either side, we will take no part in this Floral Park controversy as an official body of the church. And we urge all leaders of our organization, particularly our church school leaders, not to take advantage of their position of leadership and trust to promote their personal beliefs, especially among the children of this church, except on the basic subject covered in paragraph 1 above. And then one elder noted, I do not believe this matter to be properly before session as a subject of church business. So, resolution from Chicago Presbytery: work toward a non-segregated church in a non-segregated society. Response to the Chicago Presbytery: we'll take no part in this. This is not church business. Do we know our story? Do we know what it is we did? We, as white Christian middle-class moderates, responded exactly as white middle-class Christian moderates would be expected to respond. We stated that we'll welcome Blacks when they come to us, that we don't think it's our job to get involved, that we should be separate from society. As a matter of fact, we don't even believe that this is proper business coming before session, and therefore, the best thing we can do is to take no action. We are Billy Graham. Reach out to the Blacks, but I believe the problem of race is in loving our neighbor. Put the brakes on all of this civil rights stuff, and then to quote Deerfield, we will take no part. How might this be seen differently from both sides? Moderation, caution, activism, advocacy. And by the way, I've put a newspaper article from that time period here where the Deerfield Project is aided by the Quakers. Just thought I'd throw that in. Now, I know that you are wrestling with these questions that I've put to you because I'm getting your feedback. Does your theological interpretation of the Bible lean more towards the spirit of the law or the letter of the law? How does your theology inform your lived expression of being a follower of Christ? Do you believe that the church must have a voice in society? Gardner Spring from a week or so ago, who demanded that the entire Presbyterian Church support the Union, or Charles Hodge, who pushed back against that, saying church and society must be completely separate. His doctrine of spirituality. Martin Luther King, Billy Graham. Do you understand the viewpoints that are different from yours? Do you support the cause in principle, but hold back on taking action? Are you more devoted to order than to justice? A negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace? That's where I'm leaving you with those questions today. But there are two more things I still want to cover. Chapter 9, I'm really going to give that to you in one slide. Chapter 9 of Tisby's book is Organizing the Religious Right at the End of the 20th Century. Tisby spends most of chapter 9 returning to the Christ versus Caesar issue and documents the religious rights blending of theology and politics. Here's the down and dirty summary of that chapter in two quotes. Jerry Falwell in the 1960s, and I'm quoting, "Preachers are not called to be politicians, but soul winners." And Jerry Falwell, 1970s, "This idea of religion and politics don't mix was invented by the devil to keep Christians from running their own country." So a pretty wide continuum, and you need to figure out where you stand on that continuum. The chapter is fascinating. I hope you read it, at least in the summary I've given you, or better in Tisby's book himself. But the second thing I want to cover before we end today are the implications. In the fight to integrate Deerfield in the 50s, what were the implications of that? And I simply first want to say, well, duh, we got a really great park out of it. Here I am playing with my grandchildren in that park. The middle picture is my oldest son who lifeguarded at that park for years and years. And let's be honest, my children benefited greatly from this park and this pool and the open space that we enjoyed in Deerfield. But how might the building of the park have hindered them? Here I'm showing you more personal pictures. For the first 10 years of our married life, Dan and I attended a Black mission church in Chicago, serving Chicago Housing Authority's Lathrop Home Project near Damon and Diversey. It was called the Church of the Good News. My two oldest children were baptized there. But as they were growing, I wanted an extra bedroom and a yard for them to play in. And I had a very good friend whose neighbor was selling their house in Deerfield. I heard the schools were good, and so we moved. I never gave it a thought that by moving to Deerfield, we were effectively isolating our children from any exposure to people of color, a place that we had grounded their lives in. What were the implications? Well, unknowingly, we moved to, and I'm quoting here, a symbol of Northern outrage. In 1959, Deerfield was arson, vandalism, firebombs, a charred wooden cross on a front lawn, unquote. That's a story I didn't understand for years. Martin Luther King said, "I have no doubt that integration will work in Deerfield." Eleanor Roosevelt said, "Deerfield is the Little Rock of housing." I gave no consideration of this implication when I moved my children to this suburb. Now, this chart is difficult to read, but it's a census chart of the US Census from 2000. Percentage-wise, the Black population of Deerfield between 1950, when it was 0.030%, grew to 2000 to 0.033%. That's an implication. I'm showing you a general visualization of America's population by race here. The US is roughly 60% white, 12% Black, with the estimate that the white population is expected to decline to less than half, 44%, you see on that left-hand chart, by 44% by 2045. And the proportion of those with multiple racial backgrounds more than double by 2060. Here's a quick look at our communities. First on the left is the US, then Libertyville, Arlington Heights, Deerfield, Wheaton, and Lake Forest. Libertyville and Deerfield were both at 0.75, not 75%, less than 1%, 0.75% Black. Arlington Heights, 1.4, Wheaton, 4, Lake Forest, 2. The fact that in 2020, Deerfield's population was still 91% white and still less than 1% Black is hardly an accident. Following the passage of the Fair Rights Housing Act of 1968, Illinois, like many states, passed its own fair housing regulations. The state required 10% of all housing to be designated for individuals and families earning no more than 60% of the area's median income. However, Deerfield applied for home rule status from the state in the 70s. Home rule status exempts Deerfield from state housing regulations that often result in greater diversity. This is a picture of those same two houses, still surrounded by open parkland. Where are we now? Well, we're still working on what to do about housing. This is a picture of the pastor from the Zion Lutheran Church in Deerfield. 60 years later, they're trying to build affordable housing in an affluent northern suburb that has been resistant to integration and affordable housing in the past. 61 years later, in 2020, affordable housing project in Deerfield clears hurdles, receiving financing. And in 62 years later, in other words, last month, the proposed development finally received full approval from our village board. It only took 5.5 years. 61 years later, the condemned integrated housing land, which became known as Mitchell Park, was renamed to Floral Park. Floral Park will now honor the name of the integrated housing development that was intended to be on that land and represent the hope of so many of our community that we can continue working to make our village a more welcome and diverse community. Deerfield is still dealing with the ramifications of decisions made about what kind of community it wanted to be. Restrictive covenants, condemned integrated housing projects, housing exemptions. And now here again, I'm putting that same question to you. We need to hear and understand our own stories. We need to remember the things we went through in order to be able to go forward in the future. We need to look at a racial autobiography, and we need to understand that whites and Blacks just might see things differently. Here are some extra credit questions. So How can the white church learn to see issues of racial justice from a Black perspective? Getting some feedback. Can we turn some mics off? There we go. How can our belief about faith and justice be expanded by listening to our Black brothers and sisters? Can we turn off the mics? Thank you. Tisby is arguing that the church must take bold, costly action to move away from the complicity and compromise with racism that it has had. And he talks about Martin Luther King's fierce urgency of now. This past week, I had a long conversation with one of my best friends. She asked me how my class was going, and we talked about it. And she said, that sounds great, but remember, we need to take things slowly. If we don't, it will just mean trouble. And I wondered with her how we might consider the pace of our slowness. Martin Luther King's fierce urgency of now comment from his I Have a Dream speech was nearly 60 years ago. How much slower do we want to go? My daughter lives in DC, so we visited the MLK Jr. monument frequently. Here are more vacation photos, and I'll give you some words from Martin Luther King. True peace is not merely the absence of tension, it is the presence of justice. We must come to see that the end we seek is a society of peace with itself, a society that can live with its conscience. The ultimate measure of a man is not where he stands in moments of comfort and convenience, but where he stands at times of challenge and controversy. We shall overcome because the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. Do we see ourselves as being strong and courageous? Moving boldly towards courageous racial justice? And do we want to take those steps? Are we really ready for bold, costly action? And if so, what might that action look like? We've quite frankly made it a little hard on ourselves by carefully crafting white suburbs that now make it difficult to engage with people of color in meaningful conversations of race. So few of them are our geographic neighbors. And are we willing to give up claiming that we as whites are colorblind, possibly for being color brave? Do we understand our own stories? Do we remember where we came from in order to be able to go forward? Do we honor our past as moderate Christian voices who shun action? Or do we take part and step out boldly into society? I'm leaving you with the words of Amanda Gorman today. There is always light if only we're brave enough to see it, if only we're brave enough to be it. Let's close in prayer. We thank you, God, for the opportunity to learn from the resistance of Black Christians during the civil rights movement. We confess to you that for many of us, we too would have been silent on racism during the civil rights movement. And we pray for the courage to stand firm when modern day issues of race and justice continue to rise. We invite you, God, to reveal areas where we can take a stand now. So next week, we're going to look at the elephant in the room and we're going to talk about Black Lives Matter.